everyone. So we are about to start our House Series debate. Welcome. The objective today is to discuss how political science can create knowledge about one of the most complex issues of our times, which is climate change. Although, of course, a very urgent problem, as we all know, requiring action is also a very contested issue. So all the knowledge that we create will be very, very welcome. And the objective today is to discuss how different methods can be used, their limitations, and the impact that such knowledge can have. So the participants in this debate, which we very much appreciate them all, are in alphabetic order. So we have Molly Andrews. She is an honorary professor of political psychology at the Social Research Institute, University College London, and co-director of the Association of Narrative Research and Practice. We have Erik Bucy. Is a Regent Professor of Strategic Communication at Texas Tech University, where he teaches and conducts research on visual politics, nonverbal communication, disinformation, and public information about the press. Then we have Silvia Fierascu. Okay, she is a lecturer at the Department of Philosophy and Communication Sciences, founder and director of the Fab Lab. I really like this name, which is a social fabrics research lab, and researcher at the Big Data Science Laboratory, all at West University, Timisoara. And last but not least, we have Akos Mate. He is a computational social scientist, a research fellow at the Center for Social Sciences in Hungary. His research area is the political economy of the European Union, and he uses methods that are related with automated text analysis, various machine learning approaches, network analysis, and more traditional econometric techniques. So next, Sebastian will very briefly explain how our debate will be organized. And again, thank you so much for being here, and I hope you enjoy it.
Yes, so thank you very much. Also for the attendance, both in the room and online. We're very thrilled that, that we created so much interest here. The way we envision these to unfold is that we now initially will give a few minutes to every panelist to talk about the specific method that they are an expert in and how this could be used to study a relevant aspect of climate change policy. And then in a second round, essentially start to open this more in terms of a sort of a debate, a conversation where we will ask questions to each other. Susana and I will ask questions on the strengths and weaknesses and the usefulness of these particular methods. And then in a third step, discuss a little bit where we see, for example, these methods could complement each other or where that is maybe not possible. And so on. And lastly, the last 20 minutes, half an hour, depending how events unfold here, we will have time for questions. Questions both from the audience here in the room, but also questions from the online audience. Right. So if you have any questions for the panelists, you can type this in the message chat online. You should type who the question is directed to so that we know who it is directed to, and we will try. We have a lot of people online. If everybody asks a question, we will definitely not have the time to answer them all, so we might be selective. But feel free to ask questions, and please make sure indicate who the question is for. That's very important, so that we also know. May not be obvious from the question. I hope I'm not forgetting anything. That's the plan, and now we see how things unfold, and we just go from left to right and start with Silvia first.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really thrilled to be here. I represent the social network analysis camp in this debate. which is actually a multidisciplinary endeavor. I believe very much in the integrating part of network analysis, bringing together mixed methods research designs. And since we talk about climate change, I think this is by definition an approach or an issue that is, it involves multiple types of players, multiple types of debates, interactions, and so on. So social network analysis as a methodology, the first thing that it can do, it can map all the stakeholders involved in different aspects of climate change. We can talk about different types of data collection when it comes to climate change issues, from more objective data collection, such as contracts, diplomatic ties, all sorts of objective interactions among different actors, to very subjective ones, like how they interact in conversations, in communications, formal and informal communications. We can map processes, for example, and formal processes and informal processes. And from there, see how communities emerge, how the network structures, the ecosystems look like, whether they are fragmented, whether they are centralized. And then what is really interesting about network analysis is that it allows you to really act on it. So, ask yourself, so what do we do with the insights and the inference that we draw from these networks? Is that we can actually talk with different or work with different stakeholders in order to mobilize, in order to bridge, in order to influence in different ways the debates and the conversation and the alliances, or perhaps the way people come together in order to solve different issues. I would be really interested to see how we can further debate different approaches very concretely around this. I'm very happy that, for example, here at KU Leuven, there is a research group, an ERC research group led by Katja Biedenkopf. She's an associate professor in sustainable politics, and she won an ERC called Polycarbon. And the entire project is about, for example, mapping the global aspect of carbon policy pricing, and to understand a little bit all the friction and the conflicts and the alliances around this. And the network approach is definitely the one that sparked or helps a lot the project to move forward. But this is obviously complemented with more qualitative or more quantitative approaches, depending on, all the different threads of research that come up from this. Thank you.
All right, I'll follow that up with something completely different. And that's a focus on visual analysis, although there are some complementary aspects to it. And I do see it also as part of a project of multi-methods. And there's both qualitative and small scale ways of analyzing images. And there's large scale, increasingly very vast, large scale ways of analyzing images that are computational in nature. But my approach is to take the issues or a crisis or any kind of major development like this, and to look at it visually. So what's the landscape of how it's represented in news, on social media, among both more formal and informal channels, and then to try to characterize that environment and do some type of preliminary analysis where you might derive out of that some consistent patterns. So it's kind of a pattern recognition process. But from a research or analytical point of view, that might end up in generating visual frames or kind of consistent containers of meaning that both on their own almost define the problem and suggest a moral evaluation. So it's kind of the definition of a frame. And you can see this consistency when you look across vast sets of images. It's a little bit harder for instance, computational tools to recognize, but if you have consistent criteria, what you're looking for in a set of images, you can at least describe the environment descriptively. And then what do you do with that? So I'm interested not only in how a problem area or a crisis like climate change is represented, but then what effect those images and the visual portrayal might have on an audience or on public opinion or on certain kind of policy suggestions or momentum in a particular direction. And do the visuals help move that? Early on in climate change, it was very hard to visualize because people kept asking, skeptics kept asking, well, where's the evidence for it? Well, we had scientific evidence of warming, but there wasn't the visual confirmation. And the minute that started to happen, you started to see more of a begrudging acceptance of this as a real phenomenon. Of course, it was among scientists, but among the activist public, and it became harder to sustain a debate against it. And so I think visuals can contribute to a kind of a lot of more, I don't know, let's say reasoned or evidence-based discussion when we treat them as information. So it's not just a distraction or kind of a decorative portrayal of what an event looks like. It's actual information. And particularly you think about weather-related issues or climate-related issues, and just think of a typical weather map. When you see that on television or when you see it on your phone, there's no question that's information. And so, you know, why do we have a hard time accepting, for instance, making the leap from that kind of scientific data to a visual portrayal of a landscape also as information? So I look at all types of visuals as information. And when you show different categories or frames of images to the audience, then you can start to see what the pattern of response is across those frames. So let me just give you two quick examples. In the case of fracking, I've studied that systematically. I'm in West Texas at a university called Texas Tech. We're 100 miles of within the or from the Permian Basin, where there's all kinds of fracking. Now, love it, hate it, despise it, it's happening. And it's a really bleak visual landscape down there, right? So anyway, it's a big topic, and particularly at a school like mine, we've got engineering school, but also a department of petroleum engineering. And as you can imagine, it's big and it's significant on the campus. So we just wanted to study the issue from this visual point of view and portray it both as an environmental risk, as well as the other argument is that it's an economic benefit. So you start to look at all the images out there about this, and it's pretty obvious when something is risky and looks dangerous, and it might represent pollution, or it might represent cloudy water coming out of the tap, or even some images where you can take a lighter and actually light your water on fire because there's methane in the water. And then you can look at the economic benefit images, which are, you know, hard hats working at a drilling site, or an issue of pump jacks out in the field. And you can kind of romanticize that a little bit, which is what the industry does, with, say, a nice sunset in the background. And then this evokes like, oh, we've got economic opportunity, and we've got energy independence. And these are different ways that the issue is portrayed, but also the way people look at it. So in addition to the image, you need to complicate or refine the analysis based on where the viewer is coming into the equation. Does the viewer support this already? Do they oppose it? Or are their attitudes towards it not even defined? And so it's important to take not only the visual landscape, but the viewers, or, you know, kind of the audience perspective on this as well. And acknowledge that in a lot of fraught issues, people haven't read up on it completely. They don't have direct experience with it. They haven't formed a very crystallized opinion of it. So they're undecided. And when you show these images, whether they're economic benefit or environmental risk, to supporters or undecideds, you get big noticeable differences. And when you show it to the mass of people in the middle, which in our surveying of it, most people are undecided, at least in the US, you get a much more mixed portrait. They see positive and negatives, they see ambiguity, they see uncertainty, they ask questions, they're not sure what it represents. And so it's a very interesting process to look at it visually, if you consider visuals as information, but also containers of meaning, and then show different viewers who already have a stance or haven't made up their mind yet on the issue. So that's where I'm coming at something like this from.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this. I have to say that I'm actually not somebody who has done research related to climate change. And I think that's the same as some of us on the panel, but it's definitely true of me. And I wanted also to say that when I was asked to speak about, my methodology, I wasn't quite sure which one that was. So I want to say, to start out with, that for me, although the course that I'm teaching here is called Political Narratives, and thank you to my class who I see right there. For me, that does not really so much represent a methodology as an epistemology, actually. The way that you regard the information that you're gathering, be it in whatever different kind of methodological toolkit. And for me, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that I have done, and that I tends to be in-depth, semi-structured interviews, sometimes carried out over long periods of time. One study I'm doing, I am in the 28th year, so this really quite in-depth trawling, okay? And it is for sure a narrative project, but it's not so because of the methodology, but because the way that I regard what I'm being told over time. But I'm going to talk for a moment then about semi-structured interviews and how I think that that might be one useful thing, only one useful thing for us to use as we're trying to find out about how people understand or don't understand, connect to the problem of climate change. So I think that one of the things that challenges is first for us to actually explore what is people's understanding of not only the world around them, but actually how this macro problem impacts on their daily lives. So Susana, I thought very helpfully introduced this session by actually talking about not only the knowledge acquisition, but also the possibility of action. And my own work very much looks at the relationship between trying to understand where people's political worldviews, looking at how mobilization does or doesn't happen, and then how that mobilization does or doesn't result in political action. So I think if you are interested in trying to get a grip on how people, why don't people who say they care a lot about climate change, why don't they do anything? Why don't we do anything? I think actually interviewing is a pretty useful thing to do. But you could also, so if you think about different sets of people who you could interview one, people who say they care and actually don't do very much. You could interview very helpfully, I think, climate change activists, actually to try to understand what happened in their accounts of how they did become mobilized. Or equally, very, very important in this sort of prism of stories are climate change deniers. And I use that word, I know it's loaded, but that's how I see it. But to see actually how people who don't at all think there is a problem, how do they construct the world? How do they understand those images, Erik? And I think that's very, very important in terms of us trying to get a grip on that. The last thing I want to do is just tell you very briefly about a very big study that I was involved with, although I myself have not done what I would call climate change related research. I was involved with a project in the UK, which was called Novella, which is narratives of varied everyday life and linked approaches. And one of the 5 projects that was on this big ESRC study was called Family Lives and the Environment. And here we were trying to examine the positioning and understanding of environment and environmental concerns within family members and groups, okay? How do kids, how do parents, siblings, how do these things enter our daily lives? And so this study was carried out over several countries and involved, but the data, and this is where I come back to that original question, it was a narrative study, absolutely a narrative study of everyday life, but the methods were interviews, archival research, secondary analysis, map making, which I think we've already heard about, which is super important, and photo elicitation. And the map making, for instance, which I wasn't part of, but I thought it was really, really interesting. So this was in India and the UK, this particular part of the project. And people went on guided walks with kids, okay, so that we could see actually how they went to school, how they came home, et cetera. And and the family had in preparation for this, decided where they should walk, okay? And this actually produced quite surprising data, actually, which they were then asked to feed into this wider story of how the environment impacts their lives. And what you end up finding is that people do go quite circuitous routes to avoid all sorts of things, or actually have impacts on their lungs but they don't necessarily say, oh, well, I'm going to become a climate change activist, therefore. So that's just the kind of thing I think that we can learn with this sort of wide range of, let's say, narrative methodologies. But I think that, and I know we're going to get to this in a moment, I think that what's really, really important is to think of this as just one piece, that we actually we might gain in-depth knowledge that way, but in terms of trying to understand prevalence and incidence of problems, narrative is not really going to be the way to go. Thanks.
Thank you. So I think my perspective is probably the most useful from the perspective of doing text as data methods. Yeah, sure. Just let me know if you can hear it. Excellent. Great. So basically what climate change does, we all know, but the other thing that it does, it generates a great amount of discourse because people talk about it, either saying that, look, it's a real problem and we should do something about it. And other people talk about it as well, like, it's just fake news, worry about things that impact your life next Tuesday. And, you know, and the amount of text that comes out of this discourse is just staggering, right? It's not humanly possible to get even just a bird's eye view of this text. And this is why these so-called big data tools, and especially when applied directly to text, are so useful, not because they are conveying the ultimate truth about the text, but because it actually gives us a chance to have an overview of what's happening. And a couple of useful avenues, I think, that you can do, and I think people are doing with text data, is that basically you can get the sentiment of the discourse. It's not just necessarily pro or against, or happy or sad. You know, sentiment can be, you know, whatever you want to define it as based on your research question. And computer models can give you, well, a number, a likelihood, like how likely that this text is, you know, pro climate change or against climate change. And in this way, you know, you can actually get a feel for how people think about this, how policymakers think about this, because you can have data from social media, where as of today, I think Twitter's API is paywalled and Facebook's has been paywalled for quite years now. But there are legal ways to get social media data, but you have to pay for it. But, you know, people talk on the news, politicians talk in parliament. There are many, many ways how you can get text data, not just speeches, you can get legal documents, all sorts of sources, and you can actually see who talks about what, right? Maybe a politician is only talking about environmental policy because she's part of a single issue policy group. Maybe a prime minister is talking about everything but climate policy, right? That's an equally telling sign that is just not something that is in the focus of the administration. And you can do this sort of thing to whole, you know, clusters of actors like NGOs, international organizations, and so on and so forth, because everyone just loves writing reports. If there's something that, you know, international organizations love to do, it's reports. They have to do reports, the flagships, the quarterly, and the, you know, the biannual reports. So you've got no shortage of input. And to match this, you know, torrent of text, the other thing is that recently, in the past 5-ish years, there's been a revolution in the natural language processing field. And the most recent manifestation of that you might be aware is ChatGPT, which is effectively a large language model, which was specifically made for this, chatbot function. But these large language models, many of these are open source and accessible by scholars as well. They can be used to identify policy topics in documents. So this is actually a project that I'm working on this is called this Comparative Agenda Project. And they have these 20 policy categories, and you can train a model. And if it sees, I don't know, a sentence from Biden's State of the Union, it can say whether that sentence is nothing, it has no policy content, or it refers to environmental policy, macroeconomic policy, and so on and so forth. So you can actually get a feel of how, I don't know, US president sees the policy space. What are the important parts that he highlights and what are non-important parts? And I think, so this method has also some connection to the network science part, and this is where I would like to close, that you can see how similar actors are, how similar the message different actors are saying. And then from this similarity, you can actually construct a network, right? So you put together similar actors, and this similarity will be another part of the network. And then this is probably one of the parts where you can join together these two methods. And well, I'm looking forward to a discussion.
Yes, thank you very much, everyone, so far for the insights. It's really interesting to hear these different perspectives, different methods, and what aspects they might be useful for highlighting or studying. I now have a provocative question for you. Maybe Molly already went a little bit in this direction, but if you had to name one, what would be the biggest limitation of the method that you're using?
I think we can also take one of the questions that we have here in chat for Molly. So, and it links well with the limitations issue. So basically it's how many semi-structured interviews is enough? In other words, how can we define and justify the scope of study based on interviews? So I think this links quite well with the limitations.
I think, let's put a quantitative question to a deeply qualitative person. It's really interesting because when I was a PhD student about 506 years ago, put the number on it, I remember having to fight very hard to have a very small number of people in my study. Ultimately, I spent 3 years talking to 15 people. And but one person who seemed to understand what I was doing, he took me out for lunch. He was a professor in the department. And he was one person who really got what I was trying to do. And he turned to me and he said, it's interesting because when somebody's going to write a biography, nobody turns around and says, why aren't you writing two? Okay. And I thought, okay, that's a really interesting answer because I want to go in the direction of Blake's, seeing the universe in a grain of sand, that if what work like mine tries to do is to understand in a very in-depth way the intersectional complexity of human identity and our relationship to subsequent action or inaction. Ultimately, I'm a political psychologist. So to me, it's really not about numbers. And that's why I absolutely think we actually need these different kinds of materials together because it's really just not about prevalence. So you could do 15, you could do, you probably can't do a huge number because there's only 24 hours in the day. And it's, so I think a really key question is how you select who's going to be in whatever, if it's an interview or if it's participant observation or it's a mixture of all these things. But I think you have to be really clear on what kind of question you're trying to answer. And for me, that really is, the response to that is not about numbers. Okay, the response to that for me is how you're going to collect your data. But you have to be clear what that question is.
I'd like to maybe follow up on this. I think for network analysis as well, one of the limitations is the input data. So depending on how you choose how to connect, it's very easy to think that everything is connected, but not everything is connected in a meaningful way. And we had a debate, for example, around urban studies, urban mobilization. What are the, what are the nodes, what are the edges, what are the entities, and what are the connections that you'll be looking at? The choice of the connection that you'll be looking at has a lot to do with what you can get out of this methodology. So indeed, the quality, and I think that also bridges back to the more quantitative approaches of big data and training models and things like that. There are the biases of the researcher who can get in the way of doing good quality science. And there's the incapacity of getting good quality data, either by scraping the internet, the different websites and things like that, or by asking the wrong people or the wrong questions. Other than that, the methodology itself, I think, is pretty powerful, as long as we know how to design the entire data collection well, and the analysis itself, how to follow up different procedures.
Should I go? Okay. My method doesn't have any limitations. No. This is going to sound odd, but the limitation is that the image has to contend with the word. At least academics and policymakers want it to. And so this is a debate I have a lot with reviewers when I want to study the image, not the policy discussion around it, or the image absent a caption telling you what to think about it, or the image not in the context of a visual meme, which completely radicalizes or distorts what the meaning of the image is, or misappropriates the image and puts it in the wrong context. And so we have difficulty in analysis getting away from words. And of course, I traffic in words, and I write in words, and I started out as a reporter, and then I realized visuals were probably more important as information carriers. So the way we process information visually is much more intuitive and naturally. We're constantly forming opinions and evaluations and emotional responses to it, but we're not always fully aware of it. So it becomes a very big challenge then to demonstrate those effects and the information effects, and to try to give visuals their due as containers of meaning. The other thing I would say is there's a tendency, and this is true for text as well as imagery, is that you never want your research, if you're doing particularly academic research, but anything that's going to have real staying power, to be completely atheoretical. So there's great repositories of text and now images online. What do you do with that? And what determines how you narrow down your models and how you design your studies and what conclusions that you draw? So you should be working with a theory, because it's a conceptual framework that allows prediction, but really gives structure to what you're analyzing. And so it's important to read broadly, not just on the empirical kind of analysis side, and that could be qualitative, that can be quantitative, but also theoretically. So what are you approaching? How are you positioning your studies in relation to this? And so just today I was talking about my workshop, priming theory, and priming says that the issues that are noticeable and important and recently breaking, so for instance, earthquake in Turkey or events in Ukraine or things that are consequential and hard to ignore, will then shape the valuations of leaders who respond to them. Now, to me, this is a visual problem, because we learn about issues in large part visually, and then the leader has to come out, or some policy advocate or spokesperson for even a company or organization has to come out and usually make a comment about it. But how that exchange happens is closely evaluated. So priming explains that, because the criteria of evaluation of the spokesperson or the leader is very much influenced by what the context of the event is. So it needs to be contextualized but theorized, and then form your predictions and what you're actually trying to demonstrate.
Everything was said for me, so I can just basically plus one everything. But I have to agree with Silvia, and basically when we are talking about quantitative research, just because the data is big, it doesn't mean it's good, right? So sometimes people tend to gloss over many things because, oh, I've got 2 million or 15 million observations, so it's got to be good. I'm sorry, that's not the case. It's still, you know, garbage in, garbage out. So you have to have good data. Without good data, you will have biased models. And it's not just for climate change or climate science. I mean, in the US, for example, you have these predictive policing initiatives where you have training data, but the training data itself is biased, right? So if you live under a certain zip code, no matter who you are, just by virtue of living under a certain zip code, the system will flag you as a person more likely to be, you know, a perpetrator or a victim. This is, you know, and this is not rooted in any sort of personalized information about you. It's just the zip code because the, you know, the training data is biased. So this is something that many people just gloss over because it's very convenient, you know, just ignorance is bliss. But this leads to trouble, right? The more applied, the more policy relevant your research is. For example, this predictive policing, it's causing real harm in the US and in places where it's applied. You know, it's the same thing with climate policy. If you can get reliable research out, it will cause harm. First, you know, maybe people use it to counteract policy. Maybe your actual policy advice will be bad. So, you know, just be safe on the data. I think that's the most important part when you're doing quantitative things. And finally, it's just a tool. So I think many people who are really into one sort of methodology, for example, when I was doing networks, I was seeing networks everywhere. When you are doing natural language processing, you are seeing text everywhere. And if all you have is a hammer, you know, you're going to just want to have nails in your way. And it's not how research should work. So I also have it that it's just a tool. So its usefulness depends on the actual questions that you're applying it to. So I guess neither networks or natural language processing or visual narratives are a single silver bullet to a solution.
I would perhaps add that one aspect that is really important, I think, in all of the methods that we're doing are the ethical issues involved with that. I mean, imagine a network is like a map, but much more sensitive when it comes to what kind of data you collect and how you show the entities being connected to one another. You can use that for good, or you can use it for harm. And once you give that to policymakers, police, or you know, other types of entities, they can act with it and they will find a justification to use it for their own purposes. So being mindful of the ethical aspects involved in, you know, interviews, visual analysis, big data, network analysis, I think that's absolutely critical. And yeah, the more applied your methods, the more they have a social impact, I think the more we should discuss and be critically assessing how we deliver the results back from the analyses. Because one way is to be very transparent about everything, but that could actually create harm. So then it's again in the responsibility of the researcher of how you communicate that back to the public or to the public or to the policy entity in order to protect the identity of certain individuals, let's say, or in order to not create further damage.
Yeah, I've got a follow up to that. So in the fracking study, you know, I wouldn't say there was pressure to do industry related research, but I remember when we submitted the article to a journal, it felt like the reviewers were probably from the UK and had a definite point of view about whether this was good or bad. And the journal was environmental communication, so they were pro-environment. We get it. And even a phrase or a term that seemed a little bit pro-industry was taken to mean that we were just doing research for the industry, and that if we were going to come up with insights about what was working and what was not working visually, did we really want to publish this because it could just be turned around and used for the industry? And my perspective is, first of all, this had nothing to do with the industry. My personal view is I don't like it, but I understand why people do it. You know, I'm probably not going to have an effect on it, but I want people to understand the public opinion environment in which the debate is playing out. And so as researchers, regardless of methodology, you do need to detach yourself from partisanship or activism. And this becomes an issue with certain kinds of research, right? And, you know, the more you're doing things, for instance, in the health space or the environmental space or in the social justice space or the humanitarian relief space, it's hard not to have a commitment and it's hard to maintain that neutrality. But I think as a researcher, you have to, this is why an emphasis on methods is so important, is you have to adhere and be true to your method and be open about how you've done it and to make that publicly available, and even increasingly to share your data sets, which is a new kind of phenomenon. And I think that way people can see that you came to reasonable and logical conclusions based on the data that you were looking at, and not to get too caught up in what your own commitments are.
I would say that, I mean, I hear what you're saying, but I think that the whole idea that we actually are and can be deeply unbiased and neutral is itself a particular kind of narrative that we tell ourselves. And actually, when someone says, I'm totally unbiased, my alarm bells go off. Okay, so I actually would challenge that, and I think it's not that you want to push your own explicit positioning, but I think you have to have a pretty clear conversation with yourself about where you stand in relation to what you're researching. And in my line of work, you also probably you will be engaged in genuine and long conversations with people, probably before they even agree to being interviewed. As my class knows here, you know, I've talked to them quite a lot about the idea of what I would call being interviewed for the job of interviewer. Why should, I mean, I remember once actually starting out some research, and the person had agreed to be part of my study. And then she met me because we had been communicating through letters. And I arrive at her door and she hears this American accent and she says, "Ooh, not that I think you are, but do you have any proof that you're not with the CIA?" Now, imagine if I say, "Well, you know, I'm very, it was a really interesting, fair enough question." Okay. If I had just said, I don't want to disclose whether or not I am and how I regard that question, you know, I mean, that research would never have happened. And fair enough. I think people, it's really understandable why they might want to know how you sit in not necessarily that you are pushing your own viewpoint, but you are a human being talking with other human beings. And I think it is more realistic to actually be clear to yourself and then also perhaps to others about what I call research and desire. What is it? Why is it that you are drawn to doing a particular kind of research, rather than, from my point of view, feigning a unbiased objectivity?
If I may just related to network analysis, this actually is a very interesting point. When you design your research methodology, how do you overcome the biases of just getting focused on a certain level of analysis? So with networks, you can analyze the ecosystem level, the community level, and the actor level. Now, what we usually are drawn to is the actor level, because that gives us familiarity, or we are, you know, objectively speaking, we are interested in understanding who are the most influential actors, let's say in a policy debate or something like that. And then if we do the research starting from the actor level, instead of, you know, exploring all the three levels of analysis, it's very easy to get stuck into narratives and into theories that you know, take out of context, out of an interdependent context, a particular actor. So if you do network analysis, then, you know, consider starting from the network level, ecosystem level, understanding what is the infrastructure, the context around the embeddedness of certain entities that you are eventually trying to understand.
Perfect. Thank you so far. I would like to take a few minutes to think about how we maybe can make these approaches work together, or some of these approaches at least. And I have sort of a random thought in my head where I'm thinking, for example, the ideas behind visual analysis, right? So you're interested in climate change and how climate change is visually represented, say pictures in, as I understand it, for example, in newspapers or in the TV and so on. What is transmitted there? Do we see, for example, do we see people losing their homes in the flood in Pakistan, or do we see refugees with sort of the implication that they're now all going to come to us and they will want something from us, right? There's very different ways of framing the same problem, kind of. And I'm wondering if that could, for example, be combined with something like network analysis, where someone identifies essentially, for example, these visuals as sort of the basis for then mapping out networks, which kinds of media outlets, news outlets map these things on the one hand nationally, but maybe even internationally, right? To the degree that these images will be transported by Reuters and others across the globe, and seeing who picks up which side of the story, for example. Would these kinds of approaches work, or would you think there's problems on your side? I don't know.
The only concern I would have is, I think they would work. I think the only concern I would have is that if you start out with a word-based platform, it tends to take over the project, and that visuals become window dressing. But I would say that in a network paradigm, or even in an intensive narrative paradigm, they're rich context for understanding, first, what is the flow of imagery, say, across social media platforms, and how is that associated with the discourse of a particular debate? And then what are the networks of kind of information flow, but of association and of repeated kind of tweets and posts. And so part of a group I'm in, Social Media and Democracy, we track a lot of this. And so it's not always an either or, but I think it's important to try to give your information containers importance and priority. The other thing is computation. We could bring that in as well. And increasingly, I mean, we've known for a long time that text can be mined in a large scale way. Well, now visuals can too, through a new field called computer vision. And it's increasingly coming into the policy arena. And we can learn a lot from large scale image analysis as well. And so fundamentally, if you're thinking about sharing, if you think about how audiences are constructing meaning, or you're thinking out the broader information flows, I think we could incorporate all of our methods. Absolutely.
So I think that this computer vision, we actually talked about this last night, and I kept thinking about it. So I think how computer vision can actually complement this effectively case-by-case picture highlights or case studies is the same way as large-scale text analysis complements discourse analysis, right? Because discourse analysis aims for the same thing as large-scale text analysis, but because human resources are finite, you cannot review the internet. You can only, review like the correspondence between two authors, for example, or editorials of the New York Times in every second week or something like that. And so I think, for example, computer vision is similarly, it's being revolutionized with this new AI. I think it's stretching the concept. But these models, and they can be used for the same thing. What's in the picture? Are people, happy, sad, agitated, standing, sitting? So all this sort of stuff you can get with some degree of probability. So of course you will always need a human to just look at the picture, like, is this a dog or is this something else? Because sometimes the model is, garbage in, garbage out. If you don't have good data, then the model, we have no idea. But I think that's one possible, synergy in the future. And everything can be a network. So that's this is why doing networks is so fortunate, right? Because you just need to figure out what connects the two actors. And if it's speaking on the same topic, then you can combine text and networks.
Absolutely. That's what I wanted to say. The image analysis, it can, you can create a network out of how the actors showing different images connect to one another. You can connect it to the text analysis, how different, keywords co-occur in speeches. You can connect it with discourse, how different players, actors have similar or dissimilar types of speeches using, the analysis of the text. Yeah, I mean, I think, from my point of view, network analysis is part of a research agenda, in the sense that, you need to be practical for your PhD thesis or for your next paper, focus on something, but eventually you can always, use, for example, network analysis in a quantitative way to extract large amounts of data and see how things are connected, and then complement that with interviews or more qualitative data. Or you can start with more qualitative methods in order to understand what is relevant to map out. There's really a complementarity of this. So as long as you have a clear objective with it, eventually, for example, I have never worked in a project that didn't have a network angle to it. To almost any research project, especially the more complex the issue you are looking at, the more how we are connected is an important and relevant question. Not only how we are connected, but things like cooperation, contestation, connectivity, influence, popularity, brokerage. All of these concepts are inherently networked concepts. And to think about political science or social sciences without thinking about how things are connected, I think it's pretty limiting in terms of what we can achieve. Of course, for your research papers, you need to start somewhere, but eventually you will end up asking yourself the questions, how are things connected?
Just two quick comments. I think one sort of quite obvious combination, actually, to go back to Erik, is really visuals and narrative. And in fact, visual narratives is one of the more sort of blossoming areas of narrative research. And as I mentioned in that other project earlier, we used a lot of photo elicitation. But I think you picked up on something that's really important, which is to make sure that actually the words don't dominate what is happening in the image, okay? And I think that there's a lot more work that needs to be done in that way. So I just think we need to think through that more. And also, just to build on what Ákos was saying, I think what you were saying about garbage in, garbage out, and that we really have to pay attention. This is also, I'm sure it's true for all of us, but for me, it's not like, that's absolutely what's critical. You can't actually, that's why I started out by saying the important thing is to be clear about what question you think you're asking and what tool is appropriate for that, and to actually test that tool and to be very precise about it. One of the things that people sometimes do with narrative research, not always, but sometimes, it's like they think anything goes, and it's not that case, okay? And to try and say, yeah, we're talking about stories, but actually, because they are so much part of everyday life, we need even that much more rigor to be clear what we are and are not talking about. So I absolutely want to, underline that in the importance for me as well.
Thank you. I'm wondering one thing related to interviews, for example. So often there's all this cross-country survey research out there, but I'm thinking, when I hear interview, the first thing I think about is a transcript. So in one way or another, some sort of text that is produced again. If, for example, we were trying to understand sort of in a more narrative way, right? What are the narratives of people in different countries? Maybe even in different languages. There's nowadays a bit more development trying to figure out how to develop tools that can deal with different languages, right? And make this to some degree computable, so to say. Do you think there would be, both of you, maybe Ákos and Molly, there might be a way to capture things like a narrative in a quantitative way, or using quantitative tools, or is that sort of an impossibility?
I'm going to give you the worst possible answer, that it depends, right? It depends on how you define the narrative. If you define the narrative as, you have a set categories of topics that form the narrative, then you can track the narrative in a quantitative way. But I would say that this sounds very limiting to a lot of people doing narrative research, right? Because you can't have, but if you have this research view or view of the world, that there are a set number of topics and which I'm interested in, then I think in this way, yes, you can absolutely track the narrative. And all these recent large language models, so some of those are multilingual, which means that the model effectively has training data from usually 100, 110 languages. It's still not all the languages of the world, but better than just the English resource. So research now focuses on these low resource languages as well. So you don't necessarily have to translate everything to English for your model to be able to understand it. So in this regards, I think these large language models are a great force equalizer for people doing research on low resource languages, and not necessarily even, you know, Eastern Europe, but Sub-Saharan Africa. It's a godsend to people doing, you know, quantitative stuff with text, working on languages that the mainstream is not really interested in.
I guess my first reaction to that, I mean, I would always like to say that I think different approaches should be put side by side. I just think you widen the picture. That's my inclination. The specific thing about transcripts, I think there's a lot of debate, because for me, the key question is, what kind of object do you think the transcript is? And how alive is that transcript? And people have different takes on that. But for me personally, and you know, some people here might sort of gasp at this, but for me, you know, I'm quite happy if I send a transcript back to somebody and they want to change stuff. I'm like, that's fine. You know, because I'm literally, I see my job as just trying to explore in-depth meaning making in process. Okay. So if somebody comes back and says, I see I said this, but in fact, I'd like to elaborate on this way or whatever. And the idea that this is dynamic, it's temporally dynamic, but it also goes across space and time. And actually the challenge for a narrative political psychologist like myself is really to capture that complexity. So my concern would be exactly yours, Akos, which is that you're, you know, if that is what you see yourself doing, and I'm not saying that is what one should be doing, but that's the kind of work that, for instance, I tend to do, then you're really flattening all that difference. Then I'd be saying, well, why are you using that narrative methodology? Because it's probably the wrong tool in this case. So.
Oh, I mean, that's interesting and important, right? I mean, I was just trying to see, discussing, right? I'm not saying this is how things should be done. Yeah. I was just trying to creatively combine things and trying to figure out whether the experts say this makes sense or not, right? Which is interesting, right? But I think we now have also still about 20-25 minutes, and so we still have some time for some questions. On the one hand, there's questions here online, but are there any questions from the audience here? Anything you would like to know? Ask the panelists, anything more specific?
Yeah, so we heard a lot of different perspectives, and I think the conversation is going in a very nice and positive way in terms of, like, you know, what is useful in all the approaches, how can you combine them? But what I love to know is, like, we also heard differences, like, where's the real differences between the perspectives? Because we heard say, like, okay, is there ultimate truth in text and or images and or narratives? So where's the...
I think this wasn't a question addressed at me, it was at them, but I do have an answer for this. So if you want to start, then I can continue. No? I was thinking, so I do, for my PhD thesis, I was doing anti-corruption or state capture research. And one of the, in choice of the method and the type of data that you use in order to serve a particular purpose. I come from Romania. Romania is the most successful country in the world to put behind bars high-level politicians and business people on charges of corruption. However, corruption has not gone down in Romania. And as a network scientist, the way I figured this out was that I took public procurement data, and I looked at how the money flows between public institutions and firms that were winning public contracts. And what it turns out is that Romania's public procurement system or interactions are a hairball. So they are very much combining, high corruption risk and low corruption risk behavior. Now, the primary method of investigation of corruption in Romania is still, like 85% of the cases are investigated based on whistleblower accounts. Now, whistleblower accounts is a subjective method of investigation, and it's, as you can imagine, very limited in terms of the time, when it comes out, where it comes out, and so on and so forth. If you, however, take a look at the ecosystem and you try to map it with objective data, you find, the sort of a better representation of the reality, one that you can legally intervene upon, than asking subjectively a person to tell you how the corruption network, a covert network otherwise, looks like. So in terms of the objective of an analysis, it matters how you start, or which method you employ more, or when you employ it. This doesn't mean that, for example, combining qualitative and quantitative doesn't work. The whistleblower accounts are absolutely fundamental to validate corruption, but it is much more efficient, effective from an institutional point of view of, distributing your resources around based on a prioritization scheme that comes from more objective data. And then you can use all the, power of these individuals who are trained to take a look at different things in order to validate corruption in a qualitative way. But if you do it the other way around, it doesn't serve the purpose of the objective. It's very hard to do it, and it's frustrating to see that. So I don't know if that sort of shows the complementarity based on the objective of the analysis.
I like the question. It's very Twitter-esque, right? You made nice friends and now you should just fight. But this is also the age-old debate, right? Practically between doing large N research and small N research. And my answer would be, the age-old answer is that, do you care about generalizing your findings or not? If you care about, having a finding that can be generalized across a range of countries, cases, time, space, whatever, then probably large N research gives you more substantive ground to stand on, right? Just by virtue of having a larger sample. Maybe with the big data approach, you might even have population data. Maybe. And that means that your findings might be more general. Whereas if you are doing these very deep dives, very focused case studies, then your findings might not travel. But should they? So that's also a question that you need to ask. And even some large databases, people claim that this generalizes. I'm still not convinced every single time that this is the case. But if I would be pressed to name what is the biggest division between these approaches, probably this would be it. That one is more artisanal and the other is more industrial in a sense, and with all the goods and bads that entails.
I would complement that by saying that with network analysis, I think the advantage of the methodology itself is that theoretically and analytically speaking, it bridges between small n and large n. So you can do, network analysis without losing the power of the numbers, the representative numbers, because the focus is on identifying the mechanism that replicates interaction types. And then whether you talk about a network of 3 people or 3 entities, states, or a network of millions, you still have the theoretical justification and the analytical power to generalize, because the focus is not on the variables or the attributes of the entities, but the mechanisms that make those interactions happen.
Again, I think it really goes back to the importance of being clear about what you're trying to find out about. And I think that if you are talking about, for instance, in my work, doing deep interviews over 28 years with a small group of people, to talk about prevalence would be absolutely ridiculous, okay? That's not what I'm trying to understand at all. And I just think that it's not, yeah, I mean, I think we can be friends because we're trying to find out different things, you know? And I think if you're going into an, an election and you're trying to find out about, predicted voter behavior, I'm actually not super interested in the deep dive of why a person is going to vote this way or that. I'm much more interested in prevalence. So I think that I kind of think that we don't stand back enough and think which tool is appropriate given the thing that we are interested in.
Yeah, one thing I would add just as a follow-up to that is that depending on the method, sometimes there's almost a demand that the method has on your attention and your focus. So when you do network analysis, when you do large scale computational analysis, when you do something like psychophysiology or probably narrative analysis, like you really need to be in that space. And that becomes your primary mechanism or your primary vehicle for understanding your research questions. I tend to be very methods agnostic. So it'd be qualitative sometimes, it'd be interview based, it'd be survey based, experimental based, working with computational scholars. I do the manual annotation. Sometimes it's social media, sometimes it's news. Like I'm really question driven when it comes to methods. So I would say the more methods, the better. And a reason for that is you want to triangulate what your findings are. So I absolutely agree that depends, the method really in some ways should answer the questions that you're interested in at the level you're interested in. But in order to get like certainty or more certainty around the answer, use multiple methods to try to get converging data. And then you can be the most certain about things.
I have a question from the online audience here, which is whether anyone would have an approach to measure if policy actors learn to deal with climate change over time, in the sense that they update their beliefs about public policy and their behaviors or decisions.
All right, I can go first. Because I think this is, so for example, quantitative text analysis is probably an ideal tool for this, right? So let's say you have a government in successive terms, for example, and you can see their messaging. And the advantage of doing it a quantitative way is that at least it's going to be internally consistent, right? So the values, the numbers, however you want to frame consistency, because there are several ways to do it, but the measure of consistency can be compared from the beginning to the end, and then you can see how the messaging changed. So I think in this regards, quantitative text analysis would be an ideal use case for this. Even so, sorry, this doesn't have to be millions of speeches, right? So this even works for a single prime minister over 4 years. And she speaks about this stuff like 100 times or 10 times, that's okay. Even you just need 2 documents, right? At the least, to see if there's a difference between them. So it doesn't have to be big data for it to work with text analysis necessarily.
I guess that you can do that also with longitudinal network analysis and try to look at opinion change over time and the pressures that come from other entities that one interacts with. There are, of course, theories that come from psychology mostly around what it means to be, surrounding yourself with different kinds of discourses, for example, different kinds of pressures that can influence the way you act, the way your attitudes, your behaviors towards certain issues.
Do we have any further questions here? Or even a comment?
There's a hand.
So this is mostly directed towards Akash, I believe. But climate politics is kind of known for a huge divergence between words and actions. So we know that actors on a multitude of levels, this is true for individuals, governments, parties, businesses, trade unions, most of them say they are in favor of climate change mitigation, but their actions do not actually back those statements up. So you would really need to have a measurement idea different than just looking for their position, right?
Absolutely. So let's say you are just analyzing BP's investor letters and their, CSR department and their messaging. That's basically you're analyzing bullshit, right? So you're not analyzing the actions. It's just empty promises. So this is why I said that it's just a tool, but it can get, if you want climate action from text, you will probably not get it. Because it's the marginal cost of writing an additional report for BP is nothing. The marginal cost of BP diversifying away from oil is billions of dollars. So that's the root cause that you mentioned, that talk and action has this huge gap between them. And text analysis, one thing that you can reveal this gap, right? Maybe with more convincing tools. But I would also agree that having the pictures attached to it, like BP saying one thing in their investor letters, and having the pictures of the immense infrastructure BP still puts into, I'm sorry if there are any BP shareholders here, I could say Shell or whatever. It's just, something that popped into my mind without any reason. But, you can contrast the physical evidence and the written bullshit, right? So that's something that I think can be productive, especially if we are coming to this from an activist viewpoint. I'm not sure if that covers the basis that you wanted. Yeah, no, obviously. So having a lot of text is nice, but it can be, and it's just one method, right? It can solve everything, unfortunately.
There's a question related online here, related a little bit to this input of text, right? You just mentioned, well, it's effectively garbage if it's written by BP, and what they are saying. Not all of it, but much of it will be just window dressing. Right? And so the question here is essentially, we know that there's these biases introduced in training data, right? If I feed them all these texts, then this all sounds very well, but the model learns something that is not really representing essentially the real world, right? So this introduces these biases. Is there anything that one can do to mitigate these biases? And the question is then also, is this an inherent part of doing this type of research? And the person says he or she sees grounding theory as really important, but it often feels like theory is not taken as seriously in the quantitative space.
Yeah.
It's not only for you, I mean, it's for whoever can answer, right?
I just cherry picked then. So the training data issue, because that's a real thing, and this is a very current research agenda, especially in the machine learning and deep learning spaces. That how can you have good training data and people are still figuring it out? And unfortunately, so there's a disconnect. So there's this new field, emerging field called AI ethics, which is concerned with questions like this precisely, like how can I have a model that's not gonna be racist, to put it very bluntly? Because usually the training data is racist because humanity has a long history of being racist, right? So everything we produced reflects that part of humanity. And if you have that as part of the model, then that's what you're going to get out of the model. So for example, how can you have non-biased training data is really, really tough, because the amount of data that goes into these models is in the gigabytes of texts. So that's the whole of Wikipedia, the whole of, you know, some proprietary text, some open source text or freely available, but it's immense. So it's not really feasible for someone to go through and say that, okay, probably Reddit shouldn't be in here or 4chan shouldn't be in here. It's an ongoing research, but AI ethics. So if someone is really interested in that, there are many good AI ethics science communicators as well, and they are doing a wonderful job of highlighting these issues as well.
There's another question here from the online audience about the potential or the limits of these methods with respect to causal identification. Right? So the causality, causal inference is one of the sort of important endeavors of science. The question, to what degree would you say the methods are actually in any way susceptible to causal inference or not?
I'm going to say something real quick. It's very important to isolate what you're actually interested in studying, as opposed to studying a very complex system or, you know, set of data or images or even text and looking at everything all at once. And so this is where differences in discipline really matter. And so as a media person, I have no problem looking at, you know, a television news report or a TikTok video and analyzing that as a unit of analysis. Whereas a psychologist would say there's way too much going on. We need to simplify it. Let's just, you know, let's operationalize complexity as 3 different symbols, and more complex would be 7 different symbols, but let's not have all this confusion going on in front of the viewer. So making inferences on that, for instance, in visuals, is if I'm studying a person and I want to know their nonverbal behavior, is a lot of times they don't allow their voice to be heard, because that can be, and the words that they're saying, because that can be diversionary. The words can end up having the interpretive force, and you're not really studying the visual then. So you have to be very careful to isolate what it is you're actually studying. And with climate change, you want to think about, you know, how are people getting information, and what piece of it do you actually want to study? And that's just really good, you know, kind of study design issues.
Well, with network analysis, this is a really difficult question to answer, simply because you have the actor influences the network influences the actor. So how do you parse the two apart? And it's difficult from 2 perspectives. So first, the question that we ask is this social influence or is it social selection? Social selection being, I mean, influence being, you know, are we forming ties based on the fact that, you know, we like something about the other person, or because we have an underlying connection or an underlying sharing of homophily with the other person. So analytically speaking, it's also difficult to parse apart the two, the underlying homophily issue. So what is the hidden reason why we connect to one another? Do we connect because, I don't know, we both eventually like the same things, or do we connect because we are part of the same institution, and so on and so forth? Regression analyses, which are the typical tools for causal analysis in quantitative science, for example, are literally the most complex models that you can think about in quantitative science as of now. Computationally, it's very difficult. And the problem is that models of specification of models with network analysis, technically, they suffer from degeneracy. That's what it's called. Because of the complexity of the different textures of the networks that you can have and the large size of them, the model cannot converge all the time. And then it's very difficult to have a theoretical specification and then to apply the regression model to it, unless you do some sort of simplification of your theoretical model in order to arrive at some conclusion statistically. So in network science, you can go both ways. You can go into doing predictions, and then the larger your network, meaning everything that is above 2000 nodes, needs to simplify the reality in order for us to be able to do causal analysis in that sense. Or you can do a very good descriptive analysis, just so responsible, just so storytelling, so to say. So yeah, it really depends on what kind of data you have, how complex your phenomenon of investigation is. But I think with networks, the best way is to first do a very good descriptive analysis. And then if you decide to go for causal questions, be mindful about the assumptions that you need to do and the simplifications that you need to do to the real data that you've collected in order to get significance. You can gain you can do hypothesis testing without doing regression analyses. And those are tools that come from network science that are not actually that much used in social sciences, especially in political sciences. So there's also this disciplinary, so to say, dogmatism. If you're a quantitative analyst, you will always, get your supervisor pressuring you to say that X causes Y. With networks, I think it's a much more complicated story that you need to get across. But I think by now, social sciences and political science has become very much aware of the network approach as being a valid way of doing research.
So thank you very much. And thank you very much, all of you, for being here. I think we now have a perfect landing. It's now 1:29, so we're going to wrap this up. I want to thank you, all the panelists, again for joining us. I want to thank you for joining us in the audience, both online and here in the room. I hope you all had a great time, enjoyed yourselves and learned something useful. I certainly did. If you did so, let me know. Also, if you didn't like it, you can also let me know. For those of you who are still attending the winter school, sorry, I hope you enjoy the rest of your classes and have a good time here. And for all the others, have a good rest of your day and week. And I hope to see you at some point in person for a similar event like that. Thank you very much.